Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with another modern deep deck dive, this time with the rebuilt Affinity. As a friendly reminder, if you do like these informative deck guides, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below, especially let us know what deck you might like to see next in these deep deck dives. So Affinity is a deck, much like Burn, Tron, Jund, has been around in some form or other since the beginning of the format. Several cards have been banned out of it, most notably Mox Opal, a card that took a hit during the same time around, I believe Faithless Looting took a hit. Not even because of Affinity, mainly because of the combo deck Crack Clan Ironworks, but it was only a matter of time until a 0 mana, hyper-efficient artifact that powered out cheap artifacts got banned, and that one hit the hay. So Affinity's kind of been in this weird limbo where it wasn't quite powerful enough on its own without the speed of Mox Opal to compete with the format, especially in a format that's been getting more and more efficient removal. So Affinity was already on the fritz with all the cheap removal that was floating around the artifact, and all the artifact destruction that's available, a bunch of hate cards that exist, things like Stony Silence, things like Smash to Smithereens, now Force of the Green Force of Virtue, I think, or Force of Vigor, sorry. So all these cards kind of combine to hold Affinity down. Well, since then, several cards have been printed that have bolstered the archetype. Mainly the cards Urza's Saga, which has been used to great effect in decks such as Hammer Time or Amulet, among other decks we've covered, along with some of the mid-range piles. And then Thought Monitor gave this deck kind of a critical mass of refill your hand cards with Thought Cast and Thought Monitor. And then, people were trying the Affinity build and, with the cards we'll cover later in one of the other builds. But most of the Affinity builds that have popped up recently have kind of gone for this hybrid, almost mid-range artifact plan. So that end, you're still playing a bunch of the cheap artifacts. You're still playing things like Ornithopter and Mennonite, as well as Springleaf Drum to get you off to a quick start, get you a little bit ahead on mana. You're playing some of the artifact lands, either Darksteel Citadel or the dual lands that we'll talk about in some of the other archetypes. Then you're playing things like Moon Snare Prototype as kind of a pseudo replacement for Mox Opal, while also allowing you to return non-land permanents to its owner's top or bottom of their library, which is a nice effect to have whenever you draw too many of these. And then, Hard Evidence, not the best card, but this does give you an 0/3 blocker and a clue token, so that increases your hard count of cheap artifacts to power up some of your other synergies. Aether Spellbomb as a rather nice interactive piece for a mono blue deck. Relic and Shadow Spear are kind of your other hits out of the Urza's Saga. Relic obviously against anything graveyard based, so Murktide, Living End, etc. Shadow Spear very good in racing situations, especially with your giant construct tokens that you can make from Urza's Saga. And then Cranial playing holdover from the other Affinity lists. This is what you happen to have double black, which this particular version will have a little bit of trouble getting, but though isn't possible with Moon Snare Prototype and Springleaf Drum in the deck. You can equip it at instant speed, otherwise this basically turns any of your creatures into a threat. Nettle Assist also turns any of your creatures into a threat. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact and or enchantment, which is important because, you have Urza's Saga over here, which is an enchantment when it's in play. And then obviously counts all of these other cheap artifacts that you've been playing. Urza, kind of a reason to go a mid-range blue pile. This is a very important card in a lot of the old Urza Blade decks, but this time it's just playing along with your strategy of playing a bunch of cheap artifacts and then continuing to get card advantage in the mid to late game. And then beyond that, when you're playing out all these artifacts and stuff, you get your Affinity costs are a lot cheaper, so Thought Cast can oftentimes come down for 1 or 2 mana, draw you 2 cards. Thought Monitor can often come down for 2 or 3 mana in the early turns, and later turns easily come down for 1 blue mana for draw 2 for a 2/2 flyer. All of these combine to form a nice, neat package that can be both aggressive and hang in kind of a mid-range grindy matchup, unlike some of the other Affinity builds that were eschewing Urza for more of the Affinity-based cards. Once again, we'll talk about things like Mirror Enforcer, Frogmite, and Sojourner of something or other. I can't remember the exact name. Sideboard cards. you have some Ashiok for any type of 4-color nonsense, as well as against Amulet. This is quite nice. Gives you some outs for, slow graveyard hate in addition to your Relics of Progenitus, and potentially even a backdoor Millwin, although this is probably mainly here for things like Amulet and 4-color, keeping them from searching their decks. Mystical Dispute, pretty good against any of the control decks or anything like Murktide and stuff, giving you some interaction against those decks. Ceremonious Rejection, very good against decks like Tron, Hammer Time, though not as good against Hammer Time, but Tron, the Mirror Match. Is there other decks? Eldrazi Tron is another deck that's starting to pop up again. So, Ceremonious Rejection, a bit of a narrow sideboard card, but very powerful for what it does. Flusterstorm, very good against any type of interactive decks, also very good against any type of control and combo decks. So, Cascade and stuff that Mystical Disputes might also come in against. Relics of Progenitus, once again, we've already kind of talked about graveyard decks. One of the weaknesses of this style of deck, especially now that you're not playing a card like Arcbound Ravager, is a deck like Living In could be very problematic, as they get all the creatures back plus wipe your board. Decks like Amulet Titan could also be problematic because they have a ton of early interaction and then a bunch of sideboard cards because they're already bringing in anti-artifact enchantment cards because of Blood Moon. And then Pithing Needle, just as a random catch-all, is quite nice. Being able to shut down problematic things like Yawgmoth, etc. Quite nice to have access to in your Urza's Saga package. Another variant of the Affinity decks that exist is the blue-white version. This trades off some of your mono-blue cards for a little bit of white interaction. Things like Portable Hole give you a removal spell with your Urza's Saga, though not always the best. A lot of the modern format is 1 and 2 drops, so that can be quite nice. Esper Sentinel, while not as mana efficient as an Ornithopter or a Memnite, does have a little bit of upside, taxing your opponent's mana or giving you card draw. Ingenious Smith kind of gives you a little bit more of a grind, being able to find artifacts while also growing in size whenever you play artifacts. Teferi Time Raveler gives you a little bit of interaction against the counterspell decks. Metallic Rebuke, quite a nice card to have access to, disrupting your opponent's key spell with a not always telegraphed mana leak. And then Urza's we've already kind of talked about, as well as Thought Monitor. Razortide Bridge, quite notable because though it does come into play tapped, it is an indestructible artifact land, which can be important. And then obviously playing a bunch of dual lands, you can't afford to play as many Darksteel Citadels, and with your Urza's Sagas already kind of tying up all your colorless things. Once again, mainly the same package for your Urza's in the main deck. Sideboard, March of Otherworldly Light and Dispatch as other interaction. Dispatch has a rather unique thing. It either taps a creature, or if you happen to control 3 or more artifacts, exiles a creature, effectively becoming a better path to exile with Meadowcraft. Void Mirror, primarily for the Cascade decks, but also pretty decent against Tron, especially if they can't get a Yavimaya or a some type of that effect going. Unlicensed Hearst, along with Relic, very good against the graveyard-based decks. Damping Sphere, decent against Tron, which can sometimes overpower you, although a lot of times they don't always care about your payoffs. Meddling Mage, when you're facing down any type of combo deck, Primeval Titan, any deck that's basically relying on one card. A lot of the same reasons it's good against with decks like 4-color Urion or out of the blue-white Hammer Time list. It's good here. Just shutting down decks that are on one key strategy. Primarily Living In and Primeval Titan would be my main guesses. Hercule's Recall for any type of artifact mirrors, primarily the Affinity Mirror or against Hammer Time and Tron. And then Spell Pierce, just a little bit more interaction for any type of control, combo, or mid-range deck. This is a very interesting version that I found. It is basically Izzet, primarily for Ragavan, which plays into Affinity strategy surprisingly well. While this deck doesn't have a ton of interaction, it does use the treasure tokens quite well, both from a mana standpoint as well as from the standpoint of the treasures themselves counting towards the artifact counts cards. Galvanic Blast, nice bit of little interaction, while a little bit of reach, which a lot of these decks kind of lack. And then, beyond that, it's also playing copies of Mox Amber, as this is a legendary deck. It has both Ragavan and Emery in the main deck. I'm surprised it's not playing Urza, but I suppose there's only so much room. It's playing an old staple, Arcbound Ravager, which allows you to sacrifice artifacts with +1/+1 counters, and then you can do some real shenanigans with moving +1/+1 counters with Arcbound Ravager in some key spots. And then, Welding Jar to protect your artifacts, as this allows them to regenerate. And then, as far as your land base, one notable card is Inkmoth Nexus, which was one staple of the old Affinity decks, along with Blinkmoth, which would often allow one-shot kills with things like Cranial Plating, hence why you might see more things like Cranial Plating in this list as opposed to Nettle Cyst. Emery, we've kind of touched on. While it is a legendary creature for Mox Amber, it also gets to bring back artifacts from your graveyard, and often this can come down for 1 mana on turn 1. Then Thoughtcast and Thought Monitor kind of rounding out your card advantage, along with Urza Saga. Nothing really notable in this package other than you have a copy of Pirate Spellbomb, there's a little bit of interaction against opposing creatures as well. Sideboard, once again, a lot of the same cards. Tormod's Crypt for the same reason. Galvanic Blast, quite nice against any type of, aggressive decks where you need a little bit of rage. S-Champion as a one-of, quite nice. Though you really don't have any way to fetch it up. Might like to see another copy or two. This card can easily get protection from everything. Wear Tear gives you some outs against opposing artifacts or enchantments. Sigh, when you need to play a little bit of a grindier game, although once again, I'm kind of surprised we're not seeing copies of Urza in this list. Metallic Rebuke, once again, when it's in the main deck or the sideboard, does kind of the same thing. And Engineered Explosives, a nice kind of catch-all against anything not named Stony Silence. And then, since you're not playing any double casting spells, Gigantha seems like a decent card to be running in your sideboard. Sorry, it's a nice companion to be running. This version's a little bit more like the Affinity lists that were popping up to begin with. That is, Affinity cards matter. Things like Sojourner of Truth has Affinity for artifacts. Frogmite can often come down as a free 2/2. And then, you're playing a lot of the same other cards. Ornithopter. Mishra's Bauble is an interesting one. Once again, it's another cheap artifact. This one allows you to cantrip. Memnite, Springleaf Drums to get ahead on mana. Shadow Spear, so a very minimalistic Urza Saga package. You basically have this, Mishra's Bauble, and Shadow Spear to go grab in the main deck. 4 copies of Cranial Plating and 2 copies of Nettle Cyst is kind of your make everything a threat card. Emery is a way to rebuy stuff out of your graveyard. And then Thoughtcast and Thought Monitor, which are kind of the staples of all of these various different versions, along with the Urza Sagas. Treasure Vault is an interesting artifact land. This is an artifact land that can obviously tap or colorless, and then in the mid to late game you can sack it, make a bunch of treasures, pump up all your guys, whether it be your tokens from this, your Nettle Cysts, etc. Sideboard has some other interesting cards. Most of these we've already talked about. Elixir of Immortality, pretty decent against any type of burn decks, and also kind of a hedge against mill in some ways. Grafdigger's Cage, quite nice against any of the Court of Calling decks, primarily Yawgmoth, in addition to being some graveyard hate, although it doesn't hit things like Murktide or Living In, so this is a little bit more limited than it would be otherwise. Spellskite, way to protect your important things. Damping Sphere, we've already covered against Tron and such. Disenchant, much like Wear Tear. Sigh, a bit of a grindy card. Metallic Rebukes as counter spells. Then Tezzeret Agent of Bolas is quite an interesting one. This is both card advantage and can turn your creatures into threats, and then has an ultimate that can threaten to end the game quite quickly when you're playing a bunch of artifacts. So this version of Affinity is a little less explored, but a lot of the same strategies apply. A lot of the more Affinity-based builds, like this one with the Sojourners of Truth and the Frogmite, are a little bit more of an aggression deck. They're trying to get your opponent dead as quickly as possible, much like the older decks. The ones with the Urza builds are a little bit more of a mid-range pile that does happen to have hard-hitting threats that can end the game quite quickly. One of the differences between this version and the old versions is the old versions had certain key cards that were very important to the strategy. You had Arcbound Ravager, you had Cranial Plating, and then depending on the matchup, you had Etched Champion and some other payoffs like Master of Ethereum to turn all your guys into beat sticks. This version doesn't rely as much on one-shot things, although Cranial Plating and Nettle Cyst are definitely problematic things for a lot of decks to deal with. Shadow Spear can get those big things creep. With the addition of Urza Saga, the big tokens can be a threat on their own. the constant card advantage of Thoughtcast, Thought Monitor, you kind of play a little bit more of a grindier game, although you're probably still a dog to something like four color Yurion Control. You probably kind of make mincemeat out of the Is It Murktide lists, as they're predicated on stopping, one key spell or two. This deck can really not only get under that mana-wise, but can also overwhelm it with card advantage on just bodies. And then, a lot of the other matchups, historically Burn was a close matchup for Affinity, although I think this version, the few times I've played against it with Burn, has felt tremendously ahead against Burn, because you're not relying on, like I said, one or two key cards that can kind of get picked apart as easily. Living End's still a rough matchup, Amulet Titan's still a rough matchup, Tron, you're probably still a little bit faster than, but they do have some draws, like, turn 4 O-Stone, if you haven't been able to clean things up quickly. There's a lot of matchups that are close, some that are swingy, but more importantly, it's the sideboard cards you're facing. One of the key cards that used to see a ton of play when Affinity was a relevant deck was Stony Silence. While it still pops up on occasion, it very rarely sees play. The main card you actually don't like to see is Karn the Great Creator, which shuts down the activated abilities of all artifacts, largely shutting down your lands in a lot of these decks. So that is a problem. Oftentimes you have to use your board to attack the Karn down, and if your opponent gets to resolve a Karn the Great Creator on an relatively empty board, a la out of some type of Red Prison deck if they happen to be running it, some type of Amulet deck in the early turns, or some type of Tron deck, and they happen to have some way to clear your board before they do, or keep your board at parity, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. That is one of the key cards. That's why things like Urza and the Urza Saga tokens are so important, just to have big bodies to threaten that particular Planeswalker. Other cards, you're going to see Force of Vigor. You're going to see things like any type of disenchant effects, Smash the Smithereens out of a deck like Burn. You're going to see cards like Kulagon's Command out of Grixis Death Shadow if they happen to be playing it. There's a lot of cards that are relevant against the Affinity archetype in addition to your normal removal spells. Your Fatal Pushes, your Solitudes, your Furies, especially in the early turns. There's a lot of decks that can kind of overwhelm with a lot of cards that can overwhelm what this deck does, but the main ones being, effects like Stony Silence and Karn on a relatively parity-driven board, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. There isn't really a lot of great answers. You saw some Weresair, some Disenchants, some soft permission counterspells, etc. Those kind of things can protect you from those effects. Otherwise you have decks that can go over the top of you. Things like Living End can really wreck what you're doing, especially without playing Arcbound Ravager in most of these lists anymore. You don't have a way of putting all your stuff in the graveyard at some arbitrary point. So it's a little bit rougher than it used to be, but even so, that matchup used to be difficult unless you had Ravager. So a lot of things that are going on. The deck has new angles of attack. It has a lot more card advantage than it used to, but it's a little bit slower and not quite as explosive as it used to be when it had access to Mox Opal back in the day. So a little bit more resilient, a little bit slower. Seems pretty decent in today's Modern. It's popped up here and there with good lists. There was another version floating around that was playing Neoform that had access to Crater Oath Behemoth. When you had Sojourner's Companion and copies of Mirror Enforcer, which is basically another Affinity effect, which were all quite important for what the deck was doing, but I think that version has just kind of proven to be a little bit too gimmicky and fragile, and while it could be a little bit more explosive than maybe these Urza builds or some of these Emery builds, I think these versions are just a little bit better set up for what the modern meta is doing. So that said, if you're an old school Affinity fan, or you just happen to like artifacts and don't want to play the deck game more time, this is a deck that's probably perfectly reasonable, and outside of the Urza sagas, I don't think a lot of the cards in this deck are particularly expensive, especially if you're not playing the Mishra's Baubles. A lot of this card is quite affordable, and it could easily be a budget deck for the most part, but, remains to be seen how it will continue to progress in the meta, and hopefully it's a deck you'll pick up and play sometime. This is Mono Blue Affinity, Mono 8, what was the card? Just Draw 8, whatever you want to call it. So, anywho, this has been John for MTG Nexus. Hope to see you for the next video. Don't forget to let me know down below what deck you'd like to see covered next.